Hi, my name is Ian Heslip, and today I'll be talking about the differences between bourbon, Scotch, and Irish whiskeys. To begin with, we'll talk about bourbon, which is my favorite of the three to drink. So in order for something to be classified as a straight bourbon whiskey, it needs to have a mash bill of at least 51% corn, distilled using column stills, usually twice, and aged in new charred oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years. Now, if a whiskey is put in a bottle that is older than 4 years old, it does not need an age statement on the bottle. However, if it's put in a bottle and the whiskey is less than 4 years old, somewhere it needs to tell you how old the whiskey is in the bottle. So, for example, take this bottle of Evan Williams. It's a single barrel, and it was put in oak, as you can see, 2003, put in a bottle in 2012. So it's almost 10 years old. Now, the reason I didn't pour a glass of this whiskey, and why I'm not going to pour other ones, is because people tend to associate color with flavor, and that's not always the case. Now, this, as you can see, is a pretty dark, rich amber color. That's because it's been in a new barrel for almost 10 years, so it's going to have that color to it. But other distilleries, particularly ones outside of the United States, will sometimes put colorant in their whiskeys to give them a darker color to make them more appealing to audiences. So that's why I'm not going to pour any to perpetuate the myth that color means rich and intense flavor. So that's your basics about bourbon whiskey, and now we'll move on to Scotch. So single malt Scotch whiskey means that the only ingredient used to make it is malted barley, and that all of the whiskey in a single malt bottle comes from the same distillery. Now, single malt Scotch is distilled using pot stills, usually run through twice, and is aged in a wooden cask for a minimum of 3 years. Most Scotch is aged for at least 8 to 12, but that's not always the case. For example, this bottle of Old Pulteney is a 12-year-old single malt Scotch, and as you can see, it's a little bit lighter than our bourbon was, even though it's older. Now that's because most Scotch is aged in used bourbon barrels or other barrels sourced from other locations that have already been filled with a spirit of some kind. So that's why it's not typically as dark. Now that doesn't mean that it's going to be any less flavorful, it just means that it's going to be different. So now that we've talked about single malt Scotch, the last one to talk about is Irish whiskey. So last but not least, we've come to Irish whiskey. Now, Irish whiskey is typically a mix between malted and unmalted barley. It's distilled in pot stills for 3 times and is aged in a wooden cask for a minimum of 3 years, typically longer than that. Now, this bottle of Connemara by the Cooley Distillery is kind of like the single malt Scotch in that it's a single malt, which means, again, it's only produced using malted barley, and that it's peated. And what that means is that when the distillers are germinating their barley, which means to get it wet so that it'll eventually produce sugar in the fermentation process to produce alcohol, they're smoking the peat below this so that it rises up and the barley kind of retains a smoky character to it. Something that most people tend to associate with Scotch, but Connemara and people at the Cooley Distillery are doing something a little differently. Now, as you can see, it's in a green bottle, unlike our bourbon and Scotch, and that's because it's of a very light color. So distillers put it in a green bottle so that people can't tell the color of it, and they just assume that it's a light, not very flavorful whiskey. A lot of distilleries in Ireland and Scotland do this just as a means to keep the color away from people. Now, this is typically a good sign because you know, at least you can sort of assume, that your whiskey in a green bottle hasn't had any colorant added to it because there's no need to because it's in the green bottle. Other than that, hope this was informative, and that's it.